I want you to imagine a scenario where the headlines scream real estate crash incoming. But what if I told you the reality is actually more complex and far-reaching than you've ever been led to believe? Now, you might envision plummeting house prices at the mention of a real estate crash, and you wouldn't be wrong because that's a classic sign. Yet, Grant Cardone is ringing the alarm bells louder, claiming that the U.S. is on the brink of the most significant real estate correction we've seen in our lifetimes, one that promises to be nothing short of epic. But here's the twist. Real estate isn't just about the houses we live in. A vast expanse of it encompasses commercial spaces, businesses, offices, and yes, multifamily properties. Now, before you jump to conclusions, it's crucial to understand that while multifamilies are indeed residential, they're not the heart of the impending crash. This crisis is unfolding as a hidden opportunity, and that's exactly what Grant Cardone says, as he says the upcoming real estate cycle means an opportunity for individuals like myself, as it's going to be an opportunity for individuals that are able to raise money to buy institutional assets from institutions for the first time in American history. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm not a billionaire. Grant Cardone is a billionaire. He has the ability to go out and buy 30, 40, $50 million properties that were once valued much higher because he has the means and the ability to do it. I don't have that. And the reason I bring this up is because the crash that's often making the headlines out there talking about the next big thing that's going to happen isn't really talking about housing at all. It's primarily focused on the commercial sector of the market. And while I realize there's a lot of issues out there with housing at the moment, housing affordability sitting near all-time lows, home prices continuing to go up year over year, along with interest rates bouncing all over the place, it would make sense for a lot of people to think that housing is probably going to crash until you look at the underlying fundamentals of the market and see that we have way more supply than we have buyer demand. And that's exactly what has been driving the housing market over the last 10 years. And unfortunately, probably going to continue doing so until we see a fix on the inventory side. So now that we've got the understanding that the housing market isn't actually going to crash, what are we talking about when we talk about real estate prices crashing? Well, we're talking about the commercial sector of the market, which in my opinion is going to lead to opportunities for people that have the funds to buy these properties. But for most people, it's not your normal buyers. It's people out there that have large sums of cash, like Grant Cardone, or even other institutions that are sitting on these large piles of money. So you're probably watching this going, okay, well, when is this crash actually going to happen? And is there a possibility that it moves through to the residential sector? Well, that's exactly what we're going to talk about right after you hit that thumbs up if you find any value in my videos at all. And while you're doing that, if you want to stay updated on everything real estate related, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. So let's take a minute here and talk about why people are thinking that the real estate market is going to crash. The commercial sector of real estate has this potential opportunity down the road. Well, understand when you finance commercial assets, things like office buildings, things like strip malls, even go as far as things like industrial buildings, you're often financing those types of properties on shorter term loans. 30-year fixed mortgages are only for residential real estate. They don't exist as an opportunity for most people buying commercial real estate unless they were able to get it from some small bank in the marketplace. For the most part, these people financing these assets are financing them on adjustable rate mortgages, somewhere between 3 and 5 years for the most part. So what happens is when somebody wants to buy a commercial piece of property, they have to go into the bank and talk about down payment and do all of the things that you do with residential. But one of the key components that the bank looks at when deciding on whether or not they'll finance the property and what terms they'll provide is they're looking at not only the occupancy of the building, but how much money that building is bringing in from the current tenants, because they have to figure out the debt service on that particular property, which means they want to see how much the mortgage payment's going to be versus how much money that property is bringing in. And just before the pandemic, a lot of these properties were sitting at high occupancy, which means they had a lot of tenants in the property and tenants were making their payments on time and rents were good. And at the time, banks were willing to lend money on these buildings. And so everything was good until it wasn't. And what I'm talking about is the pandemic. The pandemic did this shift away from in-person work because people had to stay home. They were now operating off Zoom. And you even had people moving out of their markets, moving to other areas of the country because now they could work remotely, which means they were no longer going into the office. And in turn, occupancy in these buildings went way down. In fact, many of the companies that had these office buildings have since left, leaving that office space now vacant. And if that weren't enough, you had a lot of these banks that used to do commercial loans like this have now failed. They're out of business, like Silicon Valley Bank, for example, which means there's less banks actually lending money to the commercial sector, which is creating a whole different issue. But the bigger issue at the moment, which means these adjustable rates are now coming due, and the biggest change from back when a lot of people got their original loan or even refinanced at lower rates during the pandemic, is that interest rates have gone up significantly since that period of time. On top of that, many of these buildings, the debt service now sucks because the occupancy is low, which means there's less money coming in to start with. On top of that, the new mortgage payment is much, much higher because interest rates have gone up. So now it no longer makes sense for the bank to finance this building, which is where this opportunity that Cardone is actually talking about lies. Because if the banks aren't willing to lend the money to the current owners of the property to refinance these loans at rates that could make sense for them to keep it, then the owners of these buildings only really have two options. One is continue to pay every single month while continuing to lose money, or secondly, just foreclose, let the building go, and ultimately stop throwing good money, the money in your bank account, away on an asset that no longer makes sense. And we've already started to see this in a couple of different markets across the US where these buildings are now back in the possession of the bank and the bank is trying to sell them. And in order to sell them, they're having to reduce the price significantly lower than it was just a couple of years ago, which again creates this opportunity. But typically when we're talking about this real estate crash, we're talking about assets that are worth 20, 30, 40 million dollars in many cases. And while I would love the opportunity to be an owner of one of these buildings, the reality is I don't have the funds or the means to be able to take advantage of something like this. And unfortunately, that's exactly what people don't understand when they read the headline of real estate crash. If you watch my other videos, I often say it's important to understand the context. You can't just read the headline of a news article because the media outlets create headlines to be sensational. So if you're only reading the headline, you're not really getting the context of the article. So please understand, when you're hearing the idea of a real estate crash at the moment, we're not talking about the housing sector at all. They're primarily talking about that commercial sector. But the question that a lot of people have is, can that move into the residential sector? And the easy answer for me is I don't see any way that it can. Because again, housing always goes back to supply and demand. And residential housing is completely different than commercial. Because residential, you need a place to live. You need a roof over your head. You don't necessarily need a business to go into every single day. As we've seen over the last couple of years, you can do what you need to do from the comfort of your home. That roof over your head that we're talking about is absolutely necessary. So I don't really see a way that a commercial crash moves into the residential sector unless it was able to create this massive supply of inventory, which I have no idea how that would happen. So if you're like me, instead of focusing on a crash for an opportunity, you should focus rather on the things that are controllable. Control the controllables. You can't control house prices, you can't control interest rates, but you can control what your credit score is. You can control how much money you have in the bank. You can control your budget. You can control whether or not you're ready if an opportunity does present itself by getting pre-approved and going through the process. So my advice as a real estate agent is to focus on those things that you can control so that when an opportunity does present itself, you're ready.